The elevator doors opened on the 32nd floor, and Meredith Kane stepped out into enemy territory with her chin held high, even though her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She had never imagined she would set foot inside Vanguard Pharmaceuticals, not after everything that had happened between the two companies. Her own firm, Meridian Bio, had been locked in a bitter rivalry with Vanguard for the past 3 years, ever since they had both been racing to develop breakthrough treatments for autoimmune diseases. The competition had turned ugly fast, with accusations of corporate espionage, patent disputes, and a lawsuit that had drained resources from both sides. Meredith, as Meridian's lead research director, had been at the center of it all, watching her team work endless hours while Vanguard seemed to block them at every turn. But today was different. Today, the impossible had happened. Both companies had been mandated by the FDA to collaborate on a joint safety review, after preliminary data suggested that combining elements of both approaches might actually save lives. The regulatory body had made it clear that this was not optional, and that meant Meredith had to work directly with Vanguard's team for the next 3 months. The receptionist directed her to a conference room at the end of a sleek hallway lined with awards and patents. Meredith recognized some of those patents. Her team had filed applications for similar innovations, only to be beaten by days or sometimes hours. The reminder made her jaw tighten. She pushed open the glass door and found herself face to face with Zachary York. He stood at the head of the conference table, tall and broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes were an impossible shade of blue that seemed to see right through her professional armor. She had seen his photo in business magazines, of course. Everyone in the pharmaceutical industry knew who Zachary York was. At 34, he had become the youngest CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, taking over Vanguard after his father's retirement and transforming it into a powerhouse that dominated the market. But seeing him in person was different. The photographs had not captured the intensity of his presence, the way he commanded the room just by existing in it. "Miss Kane," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I wish I could say it was a pleasure." "The feeling is mutual, Mr. York," Meredith replied, setting her briefcase down with perhaps more force than necessary. "Let us get one thing clear. I am here because the FDA left us no choice. This does not mean I trust you or your company." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion she could not quite identify. Noted, "I suppose that makes 2 of us." The meeting that followed was excruciating. They sat across from each other, reviewing data and research protocols with the kind of cold professionalism that barely concealed years of animosity. Every suggestion Meredith made was met with skepticism. Every proposal Zachary offered seemed designed to give Vanguard the upper hand. By the time they adjourned 2 hours later, Meredith had a pounding headache and a renewed determination to get through this nightmare as quickly as possible. Over the following weeks, they fell into a tense routine. Meetings every Tuesday and Thursday, conference calls on Mondays, shared documents that they both annotated with increasingly pointed comments. Meredith started arriving early to their sessions, partly to review materials and partly to avoid the awkwardness of walking in together. But Zachary seemed to have the same idea, because she kept finding him already there, coffee in hand, reading through reports with the kind of focus that she grudgingly had to respect. It was during their 5th meeting that something shifted. They had been arguing about testing protocols for nearly an hour, their voices rising in frustration when Zachary suddenly stopped mid-sentence and rubbed his temples. "This is insane," he said quietly. "We are both scientists. We are both trying to help people. Why are we fighting like this?" Meredith opened her mouth to deliver a cutting response about how his company had made fighting necessary, but the words died in her throat. He looked exhausted, she realized. There were shadows under those blue eyes, and his tie was loosened in a way that suggested he had been here long before she arrived. "Because your company tried to destroy mine," she said instead, but the heat had gone out of her voice. "We were competing," Zachary corrected. "There is a difference, and for what it is worth, I read your research on T-cell modulation. It was brilliant. We were terrified you would beat us to market." The compliment caught her off guard. "You read my research? Every paper you published, you have a gift for seeing patterns others miss." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since they had met, his expression softened. "I know you think I am just some corporate heir who inherited a company, but I earned my PhD in biochemistry before I took over Vanguard. I understand the science. I understand what you have accomplished." Meredith felt something crack in her chest, some wall she had built up without realizing it. "Why did you fight us so hard then? If you respected the work, why did you make everything so difficult?" "Because losing was not an option." His honesty surprised her. "My father built Vanguard from nothing. When I took over, there were people who said I would run it into the ground. I had to prove them wrong. I had to win." He paused. "But maybe I went too far." They looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that Meredith could not name. It was not quite understanding, not quite forgiveness, but it was something. "Maybe we both did," she admitted. After that, the meetings became easier. They still disagreed, but the disagreements felt productive rather than combative. Zachary started asking for her opinion before proposing solutions, and Meredith found herself actually listening to his ideas instead of dismissing them outright. They discovered they had more in common than just their field. Both had entered pharmaceutical research because of personal losses. Zachary's mother had died of an autoimmune disease when he was 12. Meredith's younger sister struggled with lupus, and watching her suffer had driven Meredith to dedicate her life to finding better treatments. "That is why you work so hard," Zachary said one evening after most of the Vanguard staff had gone home. They had been reviewing patient data, and Meredith had stayed late to finish a particularly complex analysis. "You are not just building a career, you are trying to save your sister." "Is that so different from what you are doing?" Meredith asked softly. "Trying to honor your mother." "No," he admitted. "It is not different at all." They started having dinner together after their Thursday meetings, at first just to continue discussing work, but gradually the conversations shifted. Zachary told her about the pressure of running a company worth billions, about board members who questioned his every decision, about the loneliness of being at the top. Meredith shared her own struggles, the imposter syndrome that plagued her despite her achievements, the fear that she would never be good enough to make a real difference. "You are already making a difference," Zachary said over Thai food one night, his eyes intense across the small restaurant table. "Your research is going to change lives, Meredith. With or without this collaboration, you would have found a way." She felt her cheeks warm at the way he said her name, like it meant something. "You really believe that?" "I know it." It was dangerous, she realized, how much she was starting to like him. How much she looked forward to their meetings, to the way his whole face changed when he smiled, to the rare moments when he laughed at something she said. This was forbidden territory. Their companies were still rivals, still locked in legal battles that would not be resolved for years. Getting involved with Zachary York would be professional suicide. Her colleagues at Meridian would see it as a betrayal. His board would view her as a threat. There were 100 reasons why this could not happen, but her heart did not seem to care about reasons. The night it all changed started with a crisis. Meredith was at home, finally relaxing after a brutal week when her phone rang at 10:30. It was Zachary, and she could hear the strain in his voice immediately. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "One of our trial participants had a severe adverse reaction. We need to review all the combined protocol data immediately." Meredith was already grabbing her coat. "I will meet you at the office." "No, the building is locked down for security upgrades. Can you come to my place?" "I have everything on my secure server here." She hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. This was about patient safety, not about whatever was or was not happening between them. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the doorway of his penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city lights, the minimalist furniture that somehow managed to feel warm rather than cold, and Zachary himself, who had changed into jeans and a navy sweater that made him look younger and more approachable than his usual suits. They worked through the night, hunched over his laptop, reviewing data and running analyses. The adverse reaction turned out to be unrelated to their combined protocol, a pre-existing condition that had not been caught in screening, but the scare had shaken them both. At 3 in the morning, Meredith stood up to stretch and found herself at those massive windows, staring out at Seattle spread below like a blanket of stars. She felt rather than heard Zachary come up behind her. "I am glad you were here," he said quietly. "I do not think I could have gotten through that alone." She turned to face him, and the distance between them was suddenly much smaller than it should have been. "Zachary," she started, but she did not know how to finish the sentence. "Tell me I am not imagining this," he said, his voice rough. "Tell me you feel it too." "I do," she whispered. "But we cannot, you know we cannot." "Why not?" He reached up, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. "Because of our companies. Because people will talk. Meredith, I have spent my whole life doing what was expected of me, building the company. Winning every competition. Being the perfect son, the perfect CEO, and I have never felt for anyone what I feel when I am with you." Her breath caught. "What do you feel?" "Like I can finally breathe," he said. "Like everything I have been chasing does not matter as much as making you smile. Like I found something I did not even know I was looking for." She knew she should step back. She knew this was a mistake. But instead, she found herself rising on her toes, closing the distance between them, and when his lips met hers, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing was forming between them. But then Zachary's hands came up to cup her face, and Meredith pressed closer, and suddenly there was nothing tentative about it. Years of tension and competition and denial seemed to pour into that kiss, transforming into something entirely different, something that made her heart race for entirely new reasons. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "This is going to be complicated," he murmured. "Impossibly complicated," Meredith agreed, but she was smiling. They decided to keep it quiet, at least at first. They needed time to figure out what this was, what it could be, without the entire pharmaceutical industry weighing in. So they continued their professional collaboration in public while stealing private moments whenever they could. Dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants where they were unlikely to run into colleagues. Long phone calls late at night when they should have been sleeping. Weekends at Zachary's place where they could just be themselves, without titles or corporate responsibilities. Meredith learned that beneath the polished CEO exterior, Zachary was funny and surprisingly goofy, doing terrible impressions of their more pompous colleagues and making her laugh until her sides hurt. He loved to cook complex recipes that he approached with the same focused intensity he brought to business. He played piano, though he claimed to be terrible, and she would sit and listen to him practice, watching his strong hands move over the keys. Zachary discovered that Meredith sang in the shower, off-key but enthusiastic. That she could not watch sad movies without crying, even when she knew the ending. That she was fiercely competitive about board games and absolutely ruthless at Scrabble. That when she let her guard down, when she stopped being Dr. Kane, the research director, and was just Meredith, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I am falling in love with you," he told her one Sunday morning, sunlight streaming through the windows while they lingered over coffee. "I think I have been falling since that first meeting, even when I was trying to pretend I still hated you." Meredith set down her mug, her hands trembling slightly. "I love you too," she said, "and that terrifies me." "Why?" "Because everything could fall apart." She stood up, pacing to the window. Our companies are still in litigation. My team at Meridian trusts me to represent their interests. Your board expects you to prioritize Vanguard above everything else. What happens when those interests conflict? What happens when we have to choose? Zachary came to her, taking her hands in his. Then we choose each other, he said simply. Meredith, I have spent years building an empire, but none of it means anything without someone to share it with, without you. You make it sound so easy. It is not easy. It is terrifying and complicated and probably insane. He pulled her closer. But you are worth it. This is worth it. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that love could somehow overcome corporate rivalry and professional obligations, and all the practical reasons why this should not work. But she had seen too many relationships fail under less pressure. The crisis came 2 months later, during a board meeting at Vanguard that Meredith was not present for. Someone had leaked information about the joint FDA project to the press, and the article painted Vanguard as being forced to share proprietary information with a competitor. The board was furious, demanding that Zachary cut ties with Meridian Bio immediately and find a way out of the collaboration. We have a regulatory mandate, Zachary told them, keeping his voice level despite the fury building in his chest. We cannot simply walk away. Then minimize the collaboration, one of the older board members insisted. Limit Meridian's access to our research, protect our interests. Their research director is one of the most brilliant scientists in the field, Zachary said. Cutting her out would be cutting out the best chance we have to actually make this treatment work. The research director you have been seen dining with multiple times, another board member said coldly. The same Dr. Kane who works for our primary competitor. This is a conflict of interest, Zachary. It makes you look weak. The room went silent. Zachary felt his blood run cold. Who I have dinner with is my personal business, he said quietly, but he could see the damage was already done. Not when it affects this company, the first board member said. We are giving you a choice, Zachary. The woman or Vanguard, you cannot have both. He left the meeting shaking with anger and something close to fear. He knew what they were doing, the game they were playing. They wanted him to prove his loyalty, to demonstrate that he would always put the company first. It was a test, and failing it could cost him everything he had worked for. But choosing Vanguard meant losing Meredith, and that was not something he could bear to consider. He met her that evening at a park halfway between their offices, a neutral space where they could talk without being overheard. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. They know, he said without preamble. My board knows about us, and they want me to end it. Meredith felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. What did you tell them? Nothing yet. I needed to talk to you first. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. They are saying it is a conflict of interest. That I am compromising the company by being involved with you. They are not wrong, Meredith said quietly. Zachary, we both knew this was a risk. Maybe we should have been more careful. I do not want to be more careful. I want to be with you. He caught her hands, holding them tight. Come away with me. We will quit, both of us. Walk away from the companies and start something new together. You do not mean that. I do. Meredith, Vanguard was my father's dream, not mine. I have given it 10 years of my life, and what has it gotten me? A board that thinks they own me. Competitors who see me as an enemy, a reputation built on winning at any cost. His voice dropped. But with you, I could be different, we could be different. She wanted to say yes. The fantasy was so tempting, the idea of walking away from all the pressure and expectations, of building something new with him. But she thought about her team at Meridian, the researchers who had trusted her, who had fought beside her through years of competition. She thought about her sister, about all the patients counting on their work. We cannot just walk away, she said. Too many people are depending on us. Then what do? Meredith took a deep breath, an idea forming. We fight, not against each other this time, but together. Zachary, the rivalry between our companies has been destructive for years. It has wasted resources, delayed treatments, hurt patients. What if we changed that? What if instead of competing, we actually merged? He stared at her. Merge Vanguard and Meridian? Why not? Our research is complementary. Your company has the resources and market reach. Mine has innovation and agility. Together, we could be unstoppable. She stepped closer, urgency in her voice. It would not be easy. It would take months of negotiations, and both our boards would fight it. But if we could make it work, we would not have to choose. We could have both our work and each other. Zachary was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him working through the implications, the possibilities. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face. It is crazy, he said. But it might just work. The next 6 months were the most challenging of both their lives. Zachary went back to his board with a merger proposal, backed by detailed financial projections and research synergies that even the most skeptical board member could not ignore. Meredith did the same at Meridian, facing down colleagues who accused her of selling out, of letting her personal feelings compromise her judgment. There were leaked memos and angry shareholders, and more than one board meeting that ended with people storming out. But slowly, impossibly, the deal started to come together. Vanguard's board could not deny that Meridian's research pipeline was worth billions. Meridian stakeholders had to acknowledge that Vanguard's resources could take their innovations to market faster. And both sides grudgingly admitted that the combined company would be a pharmaceutical giant, better positioned than either company alone. Through it all, Zachary and Meredith worked side by side, their relationship now public knowledge but no longer scandalous. They were building something together, and that changed the narrative from corporate espionage to visionary partnership. When the merger was finally announced, it made headlines across the industry. Vanguard and Meridian Bio were becoming Vanguard Meridian, a new company dedicated to breakthrough treatments for autoimmune diseases. Zachary would remain CEO, and Meredith would become Chief Scientific Officer, overseeing all research and development. The night the papers were signed, they stood together in what would become their shared office, looking out at the Seattle skyline. "We did it," Meredith said, almost unable to believe it was real. "We did," Zachary agreed. He turned to her, pulling a small box from his pocket. "And now I want to make something else official." Meredith's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. "Zachary, I know we have only been together for 8 months, he said. I know some people will say it is too fast, that we are rushing. But Meredith, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I admire you. I want to build a life with you, not just a company. Will you marry me? Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Yes, she said. Yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her, and it felt like every fight they had endured, every obstacle they had overcome, had been worth it for this moment. They were married 6 months later in a ceremony that brought together scientists and business leaders, former rivals who were now colleagues, friends and family who had watched them transform from enemies to partners to soulmates. Meredith's sister was her maid of honor, healthy and thriving thanks to a new treatment protocol that had emerged from the merged research teams. Zachary's father gave a toast about how proud he was of his son, not for building an empire, but for having the courage to change it. 3 years later, Meredith stood in the newly renovated research wing of Vanguard Meridian, one hand resting on her rounded belly, watching as the team prepared for the final phase trials of their breakthrough treatment. It had taken time, but they had done what both companies had been chasing for years. They had developed a therapy that could fundamentally change the course of autoimmune diseases, offering hope to millions of patients. Zachary came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "How are you feeling?" he asked, excited, nervous, like we are about to change the world. "We already did," he said softly. "At least you changed mine." She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had started as her enemy and become everything. "You know, I am glad the FDA forced us to work together. Are you? Well, maybe not at the time. she admitted with a laugh, but I think about how close we came to never knowing each other. How easy it would have been to stay enemies, to keep fighting instead of falling in love. She placed her hand over his, both of them feeling the baby kick beneath their palms. I almost missed all of this because I was too stubborn to see past our rivalry. I was just as stubborn, Zachary reminded her. But you were right back in that park. This was worth fighting for. You were worth fighting for. We were worth fighting for, Meredith corrected. Both of us together. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise renewed. Around them, the research wing hummed with activity, scientists working on the next breakthrough, the next innovation that would save lives. But for this moment, they stood still together, two people who had found something more valuable than any corporate victory. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had discovered that some kinds of forbidden love were worth everything. The baby was born 4 months later, a daughter they named Claire, after Zachary's mother. She had Meredith's dark curls and Zachary's blue eyes, and from the moment she was placed in their arms, they knew their lives had changed forever. Watching Zachary with their daughter, seeing the gentleness in his strong hands as he cradled her, Meredith fell in love with him all over again. Balancing parenthood with running a major pharmaceutical company was not easy, but they made it work. They tag-teamed meetings and shared late-night feedings, supported each other through product launches and first steps, celebrated victories together, and weathered setbacks as a team. The company thrived under their joint leadership, but more importantly, so did they. 5 years after the merger, Vanguard Meridian had 3 groundbreaking treatments on the market and a dozen more in development. They had won awards, been featured on magazine covers, become a case study in successful corporate integration. But when interviewers asked Zachary about his greatest achievement, he never mentioned the company. "My greatest achievement is the life I built with my wife," he would say. Everything else is just details. Meredith felt the same way. She had accomplished things in her career that her younger self could barely have imagined. She had helped develop treatments that saved lives, including protocols that had dramatically improved her sister's quality of life. She had proven herself as a scientist and a leader. But none of it compared to what she had with Zachary, to the family they had created together. On their 7th anniversary, they returned to that park where they had first decided to fight for their relationship. Claire was with her grandmother for the evening, giving them a rare night alone. They walked the same paths they had walked that day when everything had hung in the balance. "Do you ever regret it?" Meredith asked. "Choosing this path?" "It would have been easier to just end things when your board demanded it." Zachary stopped walking, pulling her close. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "Meredith, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Choosing you, choosing us, was the easiest decision I ever made. Everything that came after the merger, the company, all of it. That was complicated, but loving you has never been complicated." She smiled up at him, this man who had been her enemy, then her colleague, then her partner in every sense of the word. "I love you," she said. "I love the life we built. I love that we were brave enough to believe this could work." "We were not just brave," Zachary said. "We were right. This forbidden thing we started, this impossible relationship everyone said would fail, it became everything." They kissed there in the park as the sun set over Seattle. Two people who had defied expectations and overcome obstacles to build something real and lasting. Their story had started with rivalry and transformed into romance. And now it was simply love in its purest form, tested by fire and proven true. Years from then, when Claire was old enough to ask about how her parents met, they would tell her about the competing companies, about the forced collaboration, about how sometimes the person you think is your enemy can become your greatest love. They would tell her that taking risks for the right person is always worth it, that forbidden does not have to mean impossible, and that the best things in life are the ones you fight for together. But that was future storytelling. For now, they walked back through the park hand in hand, toward the car that would take them home, ready to continue building the life they had chosen. A life that had started with animosity and bloomed into understanding, respect, attraction, and finally the kind of love that changed everything. Meredith had been right that day when she had told Zachary that too many people were depending on them to just walk away. But she had been right about something even more important. Together, they were stronger than apart. Together, they could transform not just their companies but their entire industry, their lives, their futures. The forbidden had indeed been worth everything, because everything included each other, and that made all the difference.